Well, first of all, if you're just joining us in these daily devotional broadcasts, I welcome you, and I hope you'll find this to be an encouraging and edifying time as we spend a few minutes every day really kind of, hopefully in the beginning of our day, to set our hearts and minds on the Lord and be free from some of the many distractions that tend to intrude in our life. I always recommend people, if they can, to start their devotionals before they begin their day, simply because suddenly we find ourselves overwhelmed by just the tyranny of the urgent that goes on all around us. We all have certain requirements and things we have to take care of, especially if you're a parent with small children. You understand how intrusive that can be, and I understand. I don't want to create any guilt feelings here, because sometimes my wife used to tell me she felt like she went 5 years without really being able to sit down and read her Bible until the kids got old enough to basically care for themselves. But the simple fact was that life kind of rushes at us sometimes. And so it's really great if you can find a time, preferably in the morning, but sometimes even just at the end of the day or in between, where you can just reflect on these things. One of the nice things about this is you could download the audio portion and simply play them in the car on the way to work, which I think many people find really helpful as well. But ultimately, that's my objective, to get you into a regular, steady habit of daily Bible study, daily Bible reading, and hopefully you'll begin to see the impact that the Word of God has upon your life. Many times we go to a service or a conference and it's like getting a massive injection, and we have immediate stimulation. We feel really up. But the problem with those kind of things is they also wear off rather quickly, and suddenly we're back into the same grind. I used to see this a lot when I did family conferences and marriage conferences, that people would really come to this kind of peak moment of healing and restoration in their relationship. But a week later, they kind of had slipped back into the same patterns. And that's important, because we realize to change a habit, you have to really kind of do the new behavior for like 39 days in a row before it begins to really change how we function. And I'm no exception. I struggled for years just having a consistency in my Christian life and in my devotional life. And I think one pastor put it really well when he said that most of us became pastors because God knew we would never study the Bible unless we did become pastors. Well, sometimes I fear that was true. But I can also say at this point in my life, spending time in the Word every morning has become pretty much a habitual thing for me. And I feel like it helps me to calibrate my day and really focus the compass of my life in the right direction before life kind of invades and takes over. So if you're new to this, we welcome you, and we hope you'll get a lot of benefit out of it. That's ultimately my desire and the objective we have in hand. Well, again, if you're joining us for the first time, we've been going through the letter to the Philippians, and we've been in the second chapter. We're coming right to the end. And in the last part of the chapter, Paul goes into we call it kind of a biographical section where he talks about his relationship with Timothy, who he recalled his true son in the faith. And then also he moved on to talking about another individual, Epaphroditus, who was a man who had been sent from the church in Philippi to Paul, who at the time was imprisoned in Rome. And he brought financial support for Paul as well as some emotional support. But in the process, Epaphroditus had become very ill and apparently had come close to death. Word had gotten back to Philippi, probably so that they could pray for him. But the fact was that God was merciful. He healed him. As Paul says in verse 27 of chapter 2, he says, "Indeed, he was ill and almost died, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow." Now, it's an interesting way that he puts that. But he goes on to say, "Therefore I am all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad, and I may have less anxiety." So here Paul is saying that he's going to send Epaphroditus back to Philippi. Most likely, this letter that he wrote was carried by Epaphroditus back to the church. And we don't know altogether what his status in that community of believers was. He undoubtedly was at least a deacon. He may have been a pastor. We don't know. But he was a man who was highly respected and very trustworthy. But it's interesting how Paul phrases this. He says, I'm sending him back to you so that I will have less anxiety. I think that the NIV translation there is not really the best that it can be. I mean, this is the problem with translations. Translations can be fiercely literal, and I think that's what the NIV is here in this point. But the problem is sometimes things need to be understood in a more expansive way. We call it a dynamic translation, and a lot of times what we do when we're teaching the Bible is we read the scriptures and we try to basically exegete it as literally as we can, but then we want to take that message, that truth, and apply it to our modern and personal context. And that's where sometimes, most of the time, people like myself have to become more dynamic in our explanation, because we have a tendency to see things that happened 2,000 years ago as being a different world or dynamic than we face today. We have different technology, we may have different lifestyles, but in reality, people are always the same and have always been the same and struggle with all the same issues. And that's not only true of ancient times, but it's even true of present times, that we may see various language and cultural differences around the world. But I've discovered that people are people. And one of the amazing dynamics of the Bible is it's so profoundly transferable that I've been able to teach on marriage and family relationships in India and in the United States, in the UK, in Russia, in Germany, in Hungary, all these different countries where I've had the opportunity to minister over the years. And I find that when you get down to what the basic message is and how we apply that to our own personal relationships with God and one another, then it's easily transferable. It's kind of funny because I've had people say, how do you understand our struggles here in India so well? And I can simply say, well, they may come in a different package or a different wrapper, but we have the same struggles in America too. Today, men have trouble loving their wife as Christ loved the church, and wives have trouble respecting their husbands as the church should respect and honor Christ. So, I mean, these are very, very basic dynamics, and that's one of the reasons why Christianity has been so transferable. Because unlike Islam, which is locked into a 7th century medieval desert culture of the Arabs, and everything they try to translate into our culture, that's why when Islam comes into various cultures, it demands that everybody leave their culture and conform to it. And same way with many forms of Judaism and other religions. But Christianity is above culture, that it takes into consideration in a very interesting way that every culture is different, but the underlying truths, the foundational truths of life are the same across the board. And so the same thing is true here as Paul's talking about, again, if I get back to the text, he's talking about, I may have less anxiety. I like the way the Amplified translation, actually what it does is it amplifies the translation. It says that when he comes back, you may rejoice, and I may be less concerned about you. So what Paul's saying is, I really worried about your welfare if something were to happen to Epaphroditus. This suggests to us that Epaphroditus was a key leader in that church, somebody who was really looked to for direction and for support and counsel and guidance and just overall pastoral care. And so he says, if he was, basically got sick and died and was out of the picture, then I would realize there was a major spiritual void in the congregation. And as a result, the church might have to go through some difficult transitions. That's one of those things that's kind of reality that we don't often think about. But leadership within a church has the ability to kind of set a good tone. And if they do, there is a consistency that carries over and brings a stability into the church. In fact, I was really kind of blown away this last week because one long-term member of our congregation passed away, and rather suddenly from a very quick-moving and unusual cancer cell in his body. And it was one of my friends, one of my elders who was there with him right at the end, said his last words were, he said, "Tell Pastor Ken I appreciate his consistency over all these years." And he said, secondly, that it's always good to feel the sting of conviction from time to time. Those are the people that you want to multiply, and you never want them to leave the church. And when they do, you feel the absence. But also something I'm very conscious of is when the day that I'm no longer able to minister to my congregation, the church is going to go through a transition. And part of the objective is to make that transition as smooth and eventful as possible. And that's what Paul's concern was. In fact, he told the he told the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 11:28, about after he lists all of the hardships, the difficulties, and the challenges he had faced in his ministry, he says, besides everything else, the shipwrecks, the beatings, all the rest, he says, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all of the churches. And so here again, what Paul says is what really makes the difference is when you care about the people. Pastors have really a three-level obligation, as Jesus related to it in John 22 when he said that we're to feed the sheep, care for the sheep, and tend for the sheep. So basically feeding them means we teach them the word. Caring for them is to minister to their anxieties, their struggles, their difficulties, and give them direction. And tend them, make sure that they stay within the right parameters, that they don't drift into false theology. Well, one of the things we see in Paul's letters is these things weighed heavy on his mind all the time. And I would just say, if you're a pastor and happen to be listening to it, I would encourage you, don't worry so much about the size of your congregation, the growth of your church, the income of the church, and a lot of those kind of things that oftentimes consume pastors. What I'd say is focus on one simple task: caring for, tending, and feeding that flock of God that he has given you responsibility. For me, that was a key transition, because as a young man, I was pretty much concerned about being successful, and you were always counting nickels and noses, to see how the ministry was going. And there came a point where God just really delivered me from that, and I realized that none of that really mattered. All that mattered was that I was faithful to feed, to care, and to tend the flock that God had given me the oversight of. And everything else would fall in place if I was faithful to do that. And it's proven to be true. So there's a pressure there. There's a concern there. Granted, that's what drives you to prayer and ultimately asking God to do things in your people's lives that you can't do. So hopefully these daily devotionals will be part of the process in your life as well, to help you become cared for, tended, and fed through the ministry of the Holy Spirit and the teaching of his word. Wow. Didn't plan on going there. Hey, we'll pick this up tomorrow. Many blessings.